Although he died more than 400 years ago, Giorgio Vasari's impact on art is still unmatched. His great book, The Lives of the Artists, is the Bible of art history, a monumental encyclopedia of hundreds of painters, sculptors and architects, spanning more than 300 years. Vasari told the story of Italian art in 3 parts, as an epic journey from darkness into light. And at its culmination was Michelangelo, art's messiah. With The Lives, Vasari created art history, the modern notion of the artist, and even the very idea of the Renaissance. In the final part of his great work, Giorgio Vasari brings his story of art to its crescendo. He writes about the Renaissance greats, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, the divine Michelangelo. But he also brings the story into his own lifetime. These people were his contemporaries, so suddenly the master storyteller has got scores to settle, friends to reward, enemies to punish. And at last, the shadowy figure of Giorgio Vasari himself, the man at the centre of this web of fabrications, comes fully into focus. Vasari argued that Renaissance art had developed out of the barbarism of the Dark Ages. He believed that artists of his own period, the 16th century, had surpassed the achievements of ancient Greece and Rome, and he celebrated above all the achievements of 3 titans: Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo. But he didn't just trumpet the glory of his golden age, he judged it too. "I have striven not only to say what these craftsmen have done," Vasari writes in The Lives, "but also to distinguish the better from the good and the best from the better." Anatomist, musician, botanist, engineer, architect, and of course painter, Leonardo da Vinci was the archetypal Renaissance man, and Vasari's first great hero of the Golden Age. For Giorgio Vasari, the final culminating phase of the Renaissance begins with Leonardo, and there's no better place to look at Leonardo with Vasari than here in Santa Maria delle Grazie, where we've got the Great Last Supper, the only one of Leonardo's monumental works that survives from Vasari's time. Now, what did he see when he looked at it? Vasari tells us that what Leonardo did, his great innovation in creating this picture, was to express and unfold the anxiety felt by all of the disciples, as Christ says, "One of you is to betray me." And Vasari spends a lot of time talking about that sense of interior emotion that Leonardo expresses on the faces and in the hands, in the bodies. We're not in the world of theatre, we're much more in the world of cinema, the world of the close-up view of the face trembling with emotion. And even though Leonardo's work is so wrecked by time, you can still feel that sense of emotion that Vasari responded to so strongly. It's almost as if by saying this, "One of you will betray me," by making that announcement, Christ has, so to speak, dropped a pebble into the communal pool of emotion. Leonardo studied wave motion, and it is almost as if the emotions ripple out from that central figure of Christ. In many ways, Vasari was very much not on home territory when discussing Leonardo, because it's hard to imagine an artist further from Vasari himself. Vasari never, ever, ever left a work unfinished. He prided himself on getting the job done. Vasari was obsessed with climbing the ladder to fame. Leonardo was the opposite of that. He was a speculative thinker. He wasted years of his life, in Vasari's terms, on meaningless hypothesis, speculation, experiment. Vasari was amazed by the way Leonardo took ages over the smallest detail. But he also recognized that this was key to Leonardo's originality. What it goes to the heart of is this idea, as Vasari says, of the artist who just thinks. He thinks for several days and then the perfect brushstroke. It's transformed it. In fact, you could go so far as to say that it was Giorgio Vasari who turned Leonardo's most famous portrait into the world's room of the 500 in the Palazzo Vecchio, the seat of Florentine government. But more than 40 years after Leonardo's death, the Medici commissioned none other than Giorgio Vasari himself to create a new series of muscular battle paintings. Cominciamo di parlare di Leonardo contro Michelangelo in questa sala. Possiamo dire un po'?
Più che contro era più che uno scontro fra due grandi, era una grande città consapevole di avere due artisti sublimi. Nasce proprio a Firenze perché se noi riusciamo ad immaginarci in questo salone questi due affreschi monumentali, perché dovevano esserci, poi non è andata bene, ma dovevano esserci, questi due affreschi monumentali di Michelangelo con la battaglia di Cascina e di Leonardo con la battaglia di Anghiari, con le dimensioni che avevano, 15-16 metri, non ricordo di preciso, per 5-6.
Ma è possibile che dentro questi affreschi è possibile che rimane un po' di...
Io ho sempre pensato,
Leonardo.
e credo che gli esperimenti tentati siano esperimenti con macchine oppure con sistemi, come si può dire, endoscopici, cioè con delle telecamere che entrano, indagano, vedono per quello che si può vedere. Perché se anche si trovasse un solo dito di una mano, sarebbe comunque un ritrovamento importante, perché sarebbe l'attestato di un fatto realmente accaduto.
E che facciamo? Se c'è qualcosa veramente grande dentro, che possiamo fare?
Credo niente. Non è ammissibile distruggere gli affreschi di Vasari.
Vasari was a very different artist from either Leonardo or Michelangelo. More subservient to his Medici patrons, but innovative in his own way. He could almost be described as a kind of Andy Warhol of his time, because he was a pioneer of studio mass production, employing a factory of apprentices to help him carry out his major commissions. The results were admittedly uneven, but if he had painted everything by hand, Vasari could never have achieved all that he did in his lifetime. He was a compulsive overachiever, at the same time as covering Cosimo I's Sala del Cinquecento with images of Medici might, fascistic images of triumph, of thumping military victory. He was revising his monumental lives of the artists. He just designed the Uffizi Gallery. He was constructing a corridor to connect the Uffizi Gallery and the Palazzo Vecchio to the Pitti Palace, the Medici's new residence. Here was a man manically overachieving. It's as if Vasari had an absolute horror. Renaissance lifestyles of the rich and famous moment, because this is the Villa Farnesina, once the palace of Agostino Chigi, the richest man in all of Renaissance Rome. He was the Pope's banker. And what he represents is a particular moment when a rather decadent elite begins to discover in art and in the mythology of the classical world all kinds of rather interestingly erotic possibilities. He's had no less an artist than Raphael paint for him this wonderful picture of the sexy sea nymph, Galatea, running away, half running away, half turning to greet perhaps her pursuer. I think what Raphael's really painted for his patron in this image of nudity and with the wonderful three cupids above firing their darts of love at the nymph is a tremendously assured piece of mythological soft porn. But if you thought that was risque, it's really only the aperitif for a veritable banquet of erotica. And here it is, the loggia of Cupid and Psyche, a wonderful panorama of the sexual goings-on, the ins and outs of the gods of the classical past. Up there we've got the marriage of Cupid and Psyche, up there we've got the council of gods, and all around we've got naked gods and goddesses disporting themselves. And Vasari tells us that when Raphael and his school were painting these wonderfully sexy pictures, Raphael got so excited that he was unable to paint. And so Chigi, driven to distraction by this absentee artist who kept going off into the centre of town to visit his girlfriend, thought, well, the only way I can get him to finish these pictures is if I bring his girlfriend here. His girlfriend being a lady called La Fornarina, the baker's daughter. And so Vasari tells us that Chigi got La Fornarina, persuaded her at great expense to actually live in the palace. She made love to Raphael every morning and every evening, and he painted happily in between. Now, I know the whole story might be yet another of Vasari's artful fabrications, but I do think it takes you straight to the centre of this wonderfully phallically propelled series of paintings. There's sex everywhere up here, and I might be imagining it, but even the fruit and veg seems curiously overexcited. Vasari had cunningly presented the first two titans of his golden age, the libidinous Raphael and eccentric Leonardo, as brilliant but flawed. He was clearing the way for his book's climax, the perfect Michelangelo. But the line... I've come to this quiet spot in Orvieto in Umbria on the advice of my good friend Giorgio Vasari, who writes in his life of Antonio da San Gallo that just above the city walls there's one of the great miracles of Renaissance architectural engineering, a marvel to rival anything created in ancient Greece and Rome. Now, I'm a bit puzzled because at first sight what I see looks rather like a Renaissance version of a public convenience. The well of San Patrizio was created by San Gallo's son, also called Antonio. It was started in 1527 and took more than 13 years to complete.
This visit is not advisable to anyone suffering from claustrophobia, asthma and heart pathologies. So, you okay with that? Of course, in the Renaissance, I'd be leading a donkey along, laden with 2 panniers of water. The great miracle of it was, and you can see here, looking at the steps, that what he did was he constructed a kind of double helix stair, so that a mule would come in through the entrance, and it would go down and round and round and round and round and come out through a different entrance, so a constant train of animals. Vasari says that the people of Orvieto were suffering from a terrible water shortage. They were dying, and the Pope told Antonio to go there and to make a well, and that he dug this incredible structure out of the tufa, the volcanic rock on which Orvieto rests, deep, deep, deep down to the water supply, to some source. The Renaissance architect was a man of engineering, a man of mathematics. He had many dimensions to him. He was virtually a miracle worker. And Leonardo da Vinci was not the only Renaissance man. Antonio da San Gallo, who ever since he created this has been regarded almost as the patron saint of Orvieto, he too was one of the great Renaissance men. At the bottom of the well, incredible, what an incredible thing. One of the things I love about it is that you read Vasari. The reason I came here was because when you read Vasari's Life of San Gallo, he is obviously, when he came here, he felt exactly what I did, because he basically says, wow, 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 in his sort of slightly civilized Renaissance prose, but that's basically what he says. You must see it, it's incredible.
Vasari illuminates all kinds of artists who've become neglected over the years, including one to whom time has been cruel in a different way. Jacopo Pontormo, a Florentine painter, was one of the leading lights of his age, but a vast amount of his work has been lost or destroyed. Vasari tells us that Pontormo was absolutely terrified of death, to such an extent that he wouldn't even attend a funeral. And his 2 greatest surviving works give us a glimpse of his strange melancholy genius. The first, The Visitation, lies well off the beaten track in the church of San Michele in Carmignano.
There's something hypnotizingly intense about the picture, the way in which it seems to freeze this moment of charged encounter between the Virgin Mary and Elizabeth, and there's this sense of intense solidarity, solemn, tragic foreknowledge that both of them, blessed with these divine pregnancies, both of them are the bearers, the vessels of these children who will lead difficult, painful, and sadly cut short lives. There's all that in the intensity of their embrace. But I love also the way in which Pontormo's actually made their heavy, pregnant bellies touch at the moment of greeting. And we know from the Gospel of St. Luke that at that moment, Elizabeth feels the baby leap in her womb, and she feels as though she's full of the Spirit of God. And the way in which Pontormo's painted her drapery, that acid green and that tremendous scintillating orange, it's almost as if he's created in the drapery a metaphor for that idea of the baby leaping in the womb. In fact, there's almost this sense of Jesus Christ and John the Baptist communicating through the flesh of their mother. Beyond forgotten greats like Pontormo, it's as if Vasari can't bear to leave any of his contemporaries out. The fact that the Lives is such an exhaustive list of high Renaissance artists is part of the book's beauty. It's an A to Z, from Albertinelli to Zucchero. I often get the sense when reading the third and final part of Vasari's Lives of the Artists that this is a book that's almost run out of control. He'd begun with this very sort of schematic account of history and the development of art. And every artist has to fit that. Every artist is a different rung on the ladder of progress. But when you come into this incredible period, say from about 1480 to about 1530, you have this sense that the book's exploded into a carnivalesque procession of larger-than-life, strange, eccentric characters. It becomes this extraordinary celebration of eccentricity. And I think there's a kind of point to that as well. There's a subtext, as so often with Vasari, because you have to remember that he's writing in the 1550s and the 1560s. This is a moment of clampdown. We've had the Reformation. In Italy, we've got the Counter-Reformation. The Church is taking control of art again. The number one lesson is thou shalt conform. And Vasari is looking back to this period, this golden period, just 20 years ago, when artists were free and they expressed themselves. There's also a strong sense of darkness about many of the later lives, such as that of the morbid Pontormo, which may have reflected the spiritual crisis of the time. And there's a greater sense of Vasari's own psychological complexity. He has, in fact, been the subject of a study by a leading Florentine psychologist. I went to see Graziella Magarini in Florence on an appropriately storm-tossed day. Buongiorno, sono venuto per vedere Graziella.
Prego.
Che tempo brutto,
Pochissimo oggi.
Sempre di piove.
Questo è Londra che piove.
No, in questo momento c'è di sole a Londra.
Ah sì?
Sì, veramente.
Prego.
Graziella.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm very well. Parliamo italiano o parliamo English?
Both.
Okay, perfect. This is my friend. Questo è il mio amico Giorgio Vasari.
Oh, allora.
I'm going to put him on the couch.
On the couch.
Perfetto. Shall I go
Sit
here?
down, please.
Yeah. Spero di trovare un profilo psicologico del nostro amico Giorgio Vasari.
Lei saprà che è nato prematuro, sembra, che è stato un bambino prodigio, ha cominciato subito ad essere vorace, non soltanto nell'alimentazione, ma vorace anche nel conoscere, sapere tutto, voleva disegnare, dipingere, fin da piccolissimo. Tant'è vero che a me veniva in mente che un personaggio, quelli che noi oggi chiamiamo workaholic, cioè intossicati dal lavoro, alcolisti dal lavoro. Lui sembrava proprio questo. Pensi che sotto la spinta dei medici lui si sposò, ha avuto anche dei figli, non ne ha mai parlato. Era talmente preso da questa ansia divoratrice di conoscere, proprio una pulsione conoscitiva che lo divorava dentro.
Che pensa di Vasari come inventore della storia dell'arte? Il primo? Che pensa dalla sua lingua, dalla sua moda degli artisti?
Quello che lui riceveva dalla visione lo metteva dentro di sé, lo impastava con le sue cose, quindi fantasticando anche un poco, e poi lo scriveva, lo traduceva in scrittura. Ecco perché voi dite storici che che le storie di questi grandi non sono esattamente la biografia reale.
And maybe there is a bit of a twinkle in his eyes. But according to Vasari, he was a larger-than-life monster. In creating the character of Sodoma, Vasari invented the figure of the outsider artist. Who could be more outsider than Sodoma? Everything that you can do that's transgressive, he does. He's a womanizer, he's a manizer, he sleeps with his painting boys, he collects animals, he's got a fleet of racehorses, he's a gambler, he loves money more than work, he never studies. Now, the weird thing, of course, is that there's almost no evidence in the record of history to suggest that this man, here he is, Sodoma himself, was like that at all. There's some suggestion in his evident fascination with animals that perhaps Vasari was telling the truth when he made him out to be this great menagerist, this collector of animals, but the rest is a fiction. So you think, why would Vasari have invented this extraordinary character who breaks all the rules? Now, the conventional wisdom is that his life of Sodoma is one of the great character assassinations in all of art history, but I think it's much more complicated than that, because Vasari makes Sodoma such an entertaining to get right up there and look in really close detail at one of the great masterpieces of Renaissance art. Of course, they didn't make scaffolding as solid as this in Vasari's day. The lives of the artists contain some rather good stories about scaffolding. He produced figure on the whole ceiling of this reeling angel accompanying Mary on her ascent to heaven. And the subject of the painting is a sort of whirling upwards of Mary and this sort of universal joy. And there's a kind of orgiastic power about it. The funny thing is that Vasari himself, and I think he was a bit nonplussed by finding something as incredible as Correggio here in Parma, this great masterpiece, this great artist. It's almost as if he didn't quite know what to say. And if you read his life of Correggio, it's quite funny. You almost hear him thinking to himself. The cogs of Vasari's mind are going round. So he's, what can I give him? What can I give him? I've got to give him some big achievement. And for some bizarre reason, he decides to make Correggio the man who could paint hair. Human hair better than anyone else. Vasari says it again and again. Correggio, that Correggio, he could paint hair better than anyone else. Now, I have to say that looking at this, well, there are some quite nice hairdos, and they are very well painted. It's not what I'd single out. One of the things that comes across really strongly from Vasari's lives is just how much travelling your Renaissance artist did. Vasari himself travelled constantly. You find this in his life, in his own life of himself, and his life of his disciple, his pupil, Cristofano Gherardi. Not merely to earn a buck, but also to learn from other artists, to see what the great Michelangelo has done. So you get this wonderful sense of art as a kind of travelling conversation, because all the artists are obviously, it's so obvious from Vasari's account, they're all going, what's he done? What's he done? Oh, I must go to Venice and see what he's done. There's this spirit of competition that radiates from the pages of this book. The spirit of competition in Venice had contributed to the city becoming, together with Florence and Rome, one of the three great artistic powerhouses of Italy. But to read Vasari's lives, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Venice was little more than a provincial backwater. The fact is, the further you travel north, away from Florence, the less likely you are to find complete approval from Vasari. He thought that the Venetians would forever be builders wielding a paintbrush. And the funniest example of Vasari's anti-Venetian feeling is the fact that when he came here, he immediately made a beeline for the one masterpiece by a Florentine artist that he could find. Andrea del Verrocchio, who was Leonardo's teacher, started work on the Colleoni monument in 1468, and it took a remarkable 5 years to complete. The greatest equestrian statue since antiquity, it was a truly groundbreaking achievement. For Vasari, the Colleoni monument was a wonderful opportunity to indulge in a bit of typical Florentine one-upmanship, because here, in the centre of one of Venice's most beautiful piazzas, he encountered a work of Tuscan art, a great masterpiece of Florentine art. He tells that when they commissioned Verrocchio to create the work, they originally asked him to do the whole thing, and at the last minute, just when he was about to cast it, they said, well, actually, we'd rather have a Venetian artist do the body and you just do the horse. In a fit of pique, he smashed his model to pieces, he cut its head off and left the city in a rage. The Venetians sent a letter to him saying, never come back here again or we'll cut your head off. He replied, well, I don't want to have my head cut off because not even you powerful Venetians can put it back on again. But I could very easily repair the head of my statue. And they liked that reply, Vasari says, so they sent for him. paint falling on my face as if my face was a kind of floor. Now, to begin at the beginning, the different levels of the ceiling, of this wonderful ceiling, imply different degrees of closeness to God. I think the whole thing is a great kind of painted machine, and you need to know how it works. You need to know how it's put together. Now, on the bottom level, Michelangelo has represented the ancestors of Christ. These are those descended from Noah who are in a kind of benighted state of waiting. They are waiting for Christ's arrival. And he's often said to be a painter without a sense of humour, but that's absolutely not true, because here he paints them as people who are bored to death. They look like people on the tube, or people in the dentist's waiting room, fearfully waiting for that moment when they say, "You're next, come in." Then above them, Michelangelo suddenly turns up the spiritual volume, because here you've got the figures of the prophets and of the sibyls. These are the human beings through whom God communicates his message to mankind. They are both blessed and gifted, and also punished, I think, by the burdens of prophetic thought. And I think Michelangelo himself felt as though he was a kind of prophet, painting these extraordinary pictures, communicating God's message to those down here looking up. And I think he's painted them with an immense sense of fellow feeling. They are solemn, they're introverted, they're everything that we know from descriptions of him that he was. So there's a lot of projection going on there, I think. And then on the great central spine of the ceiling, he tells the story, the large story of Genesis. It's a story that takes you from the creation of the cosmos and these three great scenes in which God separates light and darkness, creates the sun and the moon, and then calls forth life from the waters. Then, almost immediately, you're into the climactic image of this great ceiling, the image of God creating Adam. It's almost like the hinge on which the whole ceiling turns. This is the moment when God, perfect God, this floating, soaring figure that hadn't been seen before in art, creates Adam, this perfect nude, probably the most perfectly beautiful figure on the whole ceiling. And the two, for this one moment of perfect symmetry and perfection, they reflect each other. And you could feel that energy of creation sparked across that thin space of air that separates the two fingers. And from then on, it's really the progressive story of man's alienation from God. This is the Genesis tale, and it's a dark one, and Michelangelo tells it in a very severe way. So we move to the creation of Eve, being pulled from Adam's rib, to this terrible scene of temptation and expulsion, rendered two images in one. On one side, Eve and Adam fall, and Michelangelo's painted it with a daring, dark air of sexuality, placing Eve's face threateningly close to Adam's genitalia. There's this profound, and it went back to the Middle Ages, this profound sense that the fall is not just a fall into temptation, it's a fall into sexual temptation. And on the other side, Adam and Eve, expelled from paradise, they leave the Garden of Eden and they enter mortal time. And you look at their faces and they've immediately aged. Eve looks back at the self that she once was with infinite regret. And from there on, particularly if you look at the deluge, it's as if, having entered the world of the fallen world of human existence, merely human existence, everything fragments and explodes. You've got the scene of the deluge where the figures are almost scattered like autumn leaves, and then the final image is this depiction of the drunkenness of Noah, an old man drunk, alone in his tent, discovered by his three sons, an image of fallen humanity. What a contrast to that image of God at the other end, separating light from darkness. It's a bleak and severe and ascetic telling of the tale of human history, and it's got a huge, solemn grandeur to it. Michelangelo may have used the occasional assistant to paint the occasional tiny bit of the ceiling, but basically it was all his own work. And when you stand here in this great space and you look up at that vast amount of painted ceiling with its extraordinary multiplicity of compositions and forms and faces and emotions and ideas. It's almost unbelievable that something that amazing could have been created by one human being. So no wonder Giorgio Vasari, in his Life of Michelangelo, Vasari helped to carry the coffin and designed my... Vasari's Lives of the Artists is itself an enormous... It's one of the magic spaces, secret spaces of Florence. There are so many, but this is really important for Giorgio Vasari because it contains so much of what his life's work really was about. This is the chapel of St. Luke, La Cappella di San Luca, in the church of Santissima Annunziata, and it was created by Vasari and a group of his friends because, as he said, he felt that the old Guild of St. Luke, the Guild of the Artists, had fallen into a poor state. And what you get from this space is the sense with which Vasari invested the artists of Renaissance Florence with a real solidarity. And over the altar, he painted an image of St. Luke, the patron saint of artists, shown depicting the very first image of the Madonna. And Vasari, no slouch when it came to self-publicity, painted the figure of St. Luke as a portrait of himself. There he is, Giorgio Vasari as St. Luke. In a sense, when one thinks back on Vasari's project, the whole lives of the artists, what was it that he really gave to art? I think he gave to art the sense that this has been a great collective enterprise, that art, image making, it's a project. And if you look down here at this plaque, I think it all comes together, because what Vasari did when this academy was founded, he arranged for the bones, the remains, the relics of a whole host of Florentine artists to be brought here And they included, by the way, the great Pontormo to be brought here and placed under this stone. Embellished it is with the images of art, the compass, the measuring tools, the pencils, the brushes. And what this conveys is really Vasari's great message, his big idea, which was that art is a collaboration. You know, that Giotto taught Masaccio, that Masaccio was then looked at and studied by Leonardo. Raphael learned from Leonardo. It's a continuum, with Vasari coming afterwards. That was his idea. And what he's saying here is that, yes, we artists are great, we're great, and we deserve to be remembered, but above all, we're all in it together.
And that was the final part of Travels with Vasari. But Andrew Graham Dixon's back here on BBC HD with the second part of The Art of Russia, Wednesday at 10. Next tonight, some stunning parallels in life.